and switch things over to JD.
Okay. How are we looking? Can you see me now, Norval?
Sure can.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I have about probably 35 slides, an interesting topic. Could probably spend several days talking about it, but I want to hit the high spots. And I know we previously, as Norval mentioned, we had a webinar a couple weeks ago that didn't work out. So I'm trying to fill in and honor some of the consistency of what that presenter may have presented, but also, as always, I've got a lot of my own opinions and pointers and things to think about that I'll also add in. As Norval mentioned, I do get the opportunity in what I do to work with risk and decision making, both in natural environments, which are ecosystems, and human health environments, as well as built environments, which a lot of that's different industries within manufacturing and production. So I get to see both sides, both from a man-made perspective and a natural perspective. And so I'll talk a little bit today about that, both from the standpoint of risk and uncertainty, and start off by that is Hurricane Florence, which is beating down rapidly on where I live in Raleigh and where my parents live on the South Carolina coast, and toward Norval, where he's probably going to get some severe flooding this weekend from the storm. So we'll talk a little bit about the storm later on. But for today, this was kind of the billing that we had from last time. So we talk about risk-based decision making in the context of what can go wrong, how likely are the problems to occur, how severe are they tolerable, and what can be done to lessen the risk. So I will touch on all those subjects today, but probably not in the detail that some of you won't. I like to say when I start these presentations that this one's not a beginner, but it's an intermediate type presentation. So hopefully the most experienced on the call, and I do have a few on here that are very experienced in risk-based decision making, maybe they'll get a few golden nuggets. And I hope all the beginners on the call get some things to think about and maybe a few golden nuggets as well. But hopefully those at an intermediate level will get a lot of the answers to the questions you may have. So a couple other observations. Systems and operations are becoming more complex. We're getting a lot more data to deal with. Machine-to-machine learning, the amount of data we're collecting even in natural systems is making it such that our intuitive risk management decisions are more difficult and sometimes less reliable. We've got to be more objective on our decision making because, of course, we can. And then again, the risk-based decision process adds to the process for systematic consideration, both within the risk decision, but also in a lot of these decisions under complexity and uncertainty, you've got to get stakeholder buy-in. So some of the processes we do in risk-based decision making are equally about getting stakeholder buy-in. So a few of the things we'll talk about today, decisions, preventive versus risk-based approaches. We'll talk about risk and risk frameworks. We'll talk about decision frameworks, and then we'll talk about a few other thoughts that I'll give to you. As I say always, I try to be practical. I'll use some real-world examples. I'll give you a lot of information. If I have a criticism in some of my presentations is I give too much information, but I'm giving you the most bang for your buck, even though this particular webinar is free. And I do like to say a few controversial things because I believe those discussions we have after the webinar are probably as important or more important in terms of learning and sharing as okay. I hope everybody can see my slide there of a water production facility.
No,
of water quality.
JD, we lost your slide share.
Huh. Okay. All right. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, let's see what I can do here.
Okay. Now we're back up.
Am I back up?
Yep, we see decisions and a piece of equipment.
Very good. Okay. All right. So now we should shift to when we talk about risk-based decision making or decision making, what is a decision? And I go back to Ron Howard's classic definition from 68 or 72. I forget the exact date of the paper, Applied Decision Theory, but it's kind of universal definition of an irrecoverable or irreversible allocation of resources. And by that, we mean basically that it's costly or very costly to change back. So you've committed some level of resources, and it's beyond just a simple mental commitment to follow a course of action. Now, what I like to say in those second set of bullets there is to ask yourself, and we all do those when we go into a staff meeting and someone says, JD, I need you to go spend some of your time looking into this. The thing you should say back if someone tells you that, or in your mind say, we've really not made a decision. We've made a course of action, which is JD, go look into this. But if someone's really made a decision, they will tell me to go spend 2 days a week of my time or some level of budget, $50,000 or $100,000, let's say, to look into something. Short of that, we have an intended course of action, not a decision. And I'll say on the flip side, the opposite of that is true. If you're ever unsure about who the decision maker is, ask yourself who is actually allocating the resources. And in my book, I talk a little bit about that, about a client we had that was buying some long lead equipment in a manufacturing facility, and everybody thought he had made a decision. They called me and said he's not going to sign the contract. And after months and months of thinking we had a decision, I called him and I said, Mr. So-and-so, you really not made the decision. He said, no, not in my mind. I'm pursuing this course of action, JD, but now I know I've actually got to purchase it. And it's done once I do it. And so that was the decision point. So I think that's important as you look at what is a decision and what's not a decision, and how you evaluate how people think of things and how you evaluate what people are asking you to do. The other thing I'll say is good decision making does not the result of good decision making. So luck can still play a role here. I see that. Yeah.
You seem to be experiencing high packet loss from what I'm seeing, and I don't know exactly what to do to solve that.
Okay. You back up?
Screen. Yeah, there it is. Prevention versus risk-based.
Okay. So let me just leave decision making for a minute. I've said my key points, so you guys saw that slide. Let me go to prevention, and I'm with mostly ASQ. I've got a lot of quality professionals on the call. So what's the big deal about risk-based from conventional ways we have done things, especially in the quality management world? Traditionally, up until 2015, with the new version of ISO 9000, the 9000 series, we looked at things as more prevention-based. That on one hand, we're going to try to cover everything and prevent everything from happening. And what resulted from that was basically a checklist mentality. So two things were happening there. One is we walked into this kind of a very basic level of thinking of checklist and not really anticipating what the risks to the business were. We were just trying to prevent everything. But then there was another case, a good argument that we can't afford to do everything. And so kind of the first counter to prevention-based approaches, which is important, is risk-based approaches. Let's go talk about risk and risk-based approaches, basically saying, as the Cambridge Dictionary says, risk-based is done or calculated according to how much risk is involved. Now, we're going to talk a lot about risk as we go through the next 20 or 30 minutes, but basically you're going to go in more of a quantitative approach to how you pursue looking at risk and ranking things. And I say on the bottom bullet, The danger with risk-based approaches is to me, it's a starting point. It's a prioritization tool. There are some things, regardless of value or perceived value, that you're just never going to do. And there's other things that you're going to do regardless of what the numbers tell you. But risk-based prioritization approaches take you down a path of saying, I'm going to work with things that are most important. The negative part of that is you are actually saying that you will live with failure in some other places. And so US EPA had a long problem for a long time moving to risk-based approaches because they were saying, gee whiz, you're actually saying some people's lives or certain types of failure in the ecology are not worthwhile. So what we should be doing is a prevention-based approach, not a risk-based approach. And EPA countered back, and US government, and said we can't continue spending 90% of our money on 10% of the problem, the last 10% of the problem. And so it really is a trade-off. But one thing I leave you with risk-based, even though it's a great prioritization approach, it does have limitations because you are saying that other things maybe are going to be run to failure and that failure may be acceptable for certain things. So that is one of the negatives of risk-based. So the pluses and minuses, the other approaches that go with risk-based is unlike the approach where lower people fill out checklists. If you're truly doing risk-based approaches, you've got to look at the overall business context and goals, which means even though I can't prevent everything from happening, I've got to fully vet out what is most important to the organization. So this checkbox mentality should go away. And in that, we should now be getting the whole organization to participate in the process. And again, the shortfall, I'll show you an example a little bit of where when we use it beyond a prioritization method, it could vary because it does depend greatly on who's defining the risk, how they're assessing the risk, and who is interpreting that risk. So that's the dangers in a risk-based approach. So define decision, let's decide risk. And I've got a couple people on the phone that I know are going to say, oh my goodness, JD's bringing out old school stuff, and how does that really apply to things? And I like this old school approach though, with the flip of the coin. That a coin, this is not our modern definition of risk or our technically appropriate definition, but we say there's uncertainty in everything we do. It could be heads or tails. Actually, if you go way back in the literature, you'll see where, and as a baseball coach of travel baseball teams, you will see where there is another option, which is there is no successful conclusion. If you're standing in the grass and you flip the coin, you can't really see whether it's heads or tail or not. Or you flip it on a table and it rolls off and lands on its edge. So there is uncertainty. There's probably 3 levels of uncertainty than just flipping a coin. But the risk, from the old school definition, is really saying all that uncertainty doesn't matter until I have skin in the game. Basically, if JD is betting Norval $50 on the flip of the coin, but Alex on the call is not in the bet, and JD doesn't know Alex $50, then there's no risk to Alex. There's maybe uncertainty, but there's no risk. It's only the 2 parties who have a gain or a loss, and usually a loss is their risk. And so this idea, and the idea of a modern book, a book in 2018 called Skin in the Game, that's the source of this, is that risk requires skin in the game. Now, the more modern definition, and the ISO 31000 International Standard of Risk, and you'll find this in the Project Management Institute, you'll find it in ISO 9000 series now, you'll find it in a lot of different places, but risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, which is a whole mouthful, but what we do classically is look down into the key aspects of the definition, which are given in ISO 31000. Deviation from the expected, either positive or negative, objectives, what may be at risk to the CEO
Lost your slide
is not the same. Yeah, I know, I'm coming with them.
Are you on a headset by chance?
No. Do I sound like I am?
No, I was just wondering maybe if you were going through your computer or not.
Yeah, it's through the computer.
Okay. Are you on a separate
Can you
line, or
see?
are you on the phone through the computer?
I'm on my network, going out through my network, yeah.
Okay. Because we're still showing a lot of high packet loss in the high 90s. So I think that's one of the reasons why we keep losing you.
Okay. Yeah, that's the best I can do right now. Can
Okay.
you see me now?
We see your screen.
You see what is risk?
Yep.
Okay. Let me keep moving.
Yep. Keep going.
Sorry about that, guys. So anyway, you can see the four different key aspects of the definition. And what I would like to leave everyone with here is anytime we start talking about risk, the reminder that risk is personal. Whose expectations are they? And then whose objectives are they? So if you remember, deviation from expectations of objectives, so that's the two questions you really need to ask is when we talk about risk, whose expectations and whose objectives. Now there's a classic little equation we use. Engineers love to use it. We call it the classic risk equation. And everybody knows that it's the consequence times the likelihood of failure. Now I just gave you the definition of risk. So this is not the definition of risk. This is only one of many ways to express risk. And as we'll talk about in the next slide, I think there are a lot of assumptions in this classic risk equation. One is independence in events. The other is expected utility theory. In other words, a nine's a nine regardless. You get into scales controversy. On my website, I've got some papers I've written on this. We've also got it down to we can deterministically determine how risk behaves, all in this risk equation. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what methodology you use to get consequence and likelihood, you're coming up with a dimensionless score. It's also rich with opinion. So even a probabilistic risk analysis like that's used in the nuclear industry or the aerospace industry, they're still looking at old data sets, many of which the equipment, production data, whatever, may be outdated, and somebody's still making an opinion in a subjective way or semi-objective way of what data to use and what not. So the methodology is opinion-based, and it's assuming we can sort through our biases. And it's also opinion-based that we can all get to consensus because the way to do this is in a group. There's other elements like there's no time element, and then there's no reflection of absolute dollars. And I would say on the picture of the right, which is the an algal bloom that I have had to look at for the past year and a half. The other thing it ignores is complexity. Again, there's dependence here, but complexity in the natural system that's being evaluated, and this classic risk equation just won't completely get you there. If I go into ISO 31010, you'll see that there's actually 20 risk analysis tools, and we'll talk about these more, but things like Monte Carlo analysis, Bayesian analysis, and Markov or Petrie analysis are three ways that you can really get to the most quantitative methods. So don't be satisfied with just consequence times likelihood to express risk. Look at other techniques like these three that are included in ISO 31010 to really nail down what risk and risk analysis is. Last thoughts on risk in this particular sense of what's wrong with this maximum utility or expected utility theory is that things do vary by variability. And sometimes in the financial sense, that's what we look at. This is a great example from an economic development project I did, which was a massive project. But if you can see the three cone diagrams here projecting the future, you can see that number 2 never really makes the break-even point there in the middle. 1 and 3 do. and you can see the yellow line, which is the median, both make about the same median amount of money, right? So call the median the average, but on average, they both make about the same. Which alternative am I going to pick? I'm going to pick the alternative on the right, which basically has less variance in it. So sometimes, even if one thing has a bigger economic benefit than another, we pick things based on lower level of variability. So really, when you start looking at that classic risk equation, it never really gets you there. A couple upcoming events that I'll give you that are coming up, and we'll go much more advanced in these topics. The Palisade Risk Conference is coming up in a couple months in San Diego, and there you can see what I'll be talking about, but that's a really, really great place if you guys haven't been or really interested in decision analysis and risk. And then RAMS, which ASQ is a major sponsor, is also coming in January of 2019 in Orlando, and it's another great place to hear about reliability, failure modes, and how risk applies to all those types of decisions. So just give you that plug. So let me move to, if we've talked about risk and its definition, now let's talk a little bit about risk frameworks. And really back to what we're asking ourselves is these basic questions. And certainly a framework is something that really helps us kind of map out the logical steps of how to be rational to get to risk-based decisions. And the pictures I show you while I'm waiting on a hurricane to hit me here. Last year I was in New Orleans, Louisiana, trying to get pumps and electrical systems repaired before the hurricanes hit there. New Orleans was, I sat in the command center when the storm turned and went to Houston last year and was able to get out of New Orleans, so we were spared. And then I was there when Hurricane Nate came in, and we just got the bands to Nate, but there could have been another Katrina in New Orleans last year. But again, going through this process on the ground, saying what can go wrong with our systems and how do they happen and where's our priority supposed to be? All of these were answered by going through a risk-based type framework. There are several frameworks. So I want to mention one. One is COSA, or the Council of Supporting Agencies of the Treadway Commission. And basically they go through a methodology. And, you know, there's a lot of people that are become either ISO 31000 types or COSA types. I'm not a type of either one. I think we need a framework. I prefer ISO 31000, but both frameworks work. But if you're in the audit world, if you're in the financial world, you'll see a lot of stuff with COSA on it. So I just mentioned there's more than one. I like to talk about, as we go through risk-based decision making, how do we come up with our risk framework through ISO 31000? And incidentally, most of these frameworks look pretty similar to each other, except how many boxes they have and how they draw different boxes around different things. So this is the classic piece to ISO 31000. And I'll start off, the thing I like to say is you can look at the center of this drawing and see where those 5 or 6 steps of what we classically think of risk. It looks very linear. But what will happen is, if you notice the 2 boxes on the right, the monitoring and review and the communication and consultation, those are things that are supposed to be happening as we go. So risk analysis, risk management, risk-based decision-making is not a purely linear process. It has to be integrated and go side to side as well as down a linear process. And a lot of quality and reliability and engineering types have a hard time getting into that back and forth, but it has to happen as you move forward. So where do we spend our time usually in practice, right? So let's get out of the frameworks and the theory a little bit, and let's talk about the practice. We spend too little time on establishing the context. We jump in and we want to start solving problems. So we go into that risk assessment phase and we just jump in and start really pounding on that blue box in the middle. So the identification, the analysis, and the evaluation. And a lot of times we just miss the whole goal of what we're doing because we're not spending enough time on the context. When you get into the risk analysis piece, and we talked a little bit about risk analysis earlier, this is where If you wanted to use consequence and likelihood, this is where you could. Failure modes and effects analysis is what probably a lot of the people on the call use a lot. A lot of us use failure modes and effects analysis to find the failure modes and identify risks related to those. Fault trees are great at looking at how things fail. Reliability block diagrams are great at looking at how things have to succeed as they move through the system and finding basically single points of failure and redundancy. So there's many others. I think probably a dozen or 15 of these that I use in different ways, but these are kind of the big four. And I would say FMEA, fault trees, and RBDs are really where on the analysis side, I do a lot of my identifying the problems and the particular modes of failure. The other thing I would say is the communication and consultation. And so that goes throughout, and I would say if we did a better job, all of us, in the communication and consultation in that establish the context and risk identification phase, we would be a lot better decision makers. And even if we're advisors, our decision makers would do a lot better job. So just a little bit of information on the risk framework, but very helpful when I talk about risk-based decision making, to say you need kind of a framework and approach as you go forward. Risk assessment, and that big block you just saw, you can see a lot of tools and techniques in ISO 31000. If you're on the call and interested in risk assessments and risk-based decision making, get you a copy if you don't, but this will go through a lot of those different tools and approaches that you can use. So again, a very rich field of practice, and really something I can't touch here, but a couple things I hope you've gotten. Risk is more than consequence times likelihood. You need a methodology or framework. Risk is in the eye of the beholder, and there are a lot of tools and approaches that you can take to both identify risk and also things like Monte Carlo analysis that really help you define uncertainties. And so that's been a lot of this first talk about really what risk-based means. So now I want to move on to what decision frameworks are, and spend a little bit of time on decision frameworks as we think about risk-based decision making. So just like risk can benefit, and our approaches to risk, especially with teams, can benefit from having a logical way to analyze things, so do our decisions. Traditional decision making, basically you will find a number of different models and frameworks. There's a 4-step models, there's 5-step, there's 6-step, there's 7-step, and there are 8-step models, all that I've identified and found in the literature. There's also a good discussion if you go back and look at things and people say, well, is it decision making or is it problem solving? Which one is a subset or the other? And I kind of fall down in the camp that decision making is the higher level hierarchy, and problem solving is what we do to help us make better decisions. There are people that would say problem solving is how we do forensic analysis and just come up with what happened, and decision making is a whole other field of problem solving. I don't think it matters, but you will see very similar approaches in these risk models, in the problem solving models as you will the decision making models that are referenced here. So the other thing that I'll leave you with this kind of decision making is that it focuses a lot, because of the academic traditions, on known things: mathematical equations, physics of failure, applications of deductive logic. It doesn't work real well with uncertainty sometimes. So let's talk a little bit more about the frameworks. The basic classic 4-step decision making framework is simply this: we define a problem, we generate options or alternatives, we evaluate those options or alternatives, and we implement the preferred option or alternative. So a very simple 4-step process. And basically where your risk-based decision making falls in line is how do we, in the context, we could generate the options or define the problem, but it's really in evaluating the options and implementing the preferred alternative. I prefer the 6-step model. Carl Spitzler and the Strategic Decisions Group in Stanford University that's where I got some of my formal training, and the formal training I like the best. They have a 6-step process of decision quality. And again, you can see the number of links here. The theory, or the application, I would say, more than the theory, it's practice, it's the practical application, says that all 6 links are equally important, and that your decisions are no better or no stronger than the weakest link. And so again, with a longer presentation on decision making, we could talk about this, but often we blow by the context or establish.
JD, are you still there?
Yep, and I should be coming back up.
Yep, there you are.
There we are. I'm getting good at this. I apologize, but we're getting good at this all of a sudden. So we rush, and what we do as technical professionals, either quality professionals, reliability professionals, financial professionals, risk managers, what have you, we all focus on that top link of meaningful, full, reliable information. So we just go collect data, just do some data. But really where our risk-based thinking comes in is establishing those clear values and trade-offs. And so from risk-based thinking perspective, that's really what we're doing. Remember I said in the beginning, risk-based means that some things are more important than others. It means that certain things may run to failure while others don't. It means with limited resources, we'll focus on these things as priority and kind of let the other ones slide a little bit. So this is really in the decision-making process where your clear values and trade-offs, your risk-based thinking come in. Now, if you go down to logically correct reasoning, a lot of that is things like, are you going to do it by consensus? Are you going to do it by force ranked? Are you going to do it by multi-criteria analysis? But that's a different block and really beyond risk-based thinking, but the logically correct reasoning is equally important too. So that's a little bit about decision making and trying to put risk-based and decision making kind of together. So now I want to give you a couple additional thoughts on risk-based decision making. And I go back to a very graphic picture when I first started in the business about 30 some years ago, or 30 years ago when this actually happened almost. So it's a graphic picture. So back as a young consultant, young engineer, some financial stuff in my blood, from my MBA back in those days, I did some failure investigations. And this happened to be in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And what you see is a bridge collapse. It happened about 5 o'clock in the morning. And as you look down the screen on the left toward the lights, there's a stoplight at the bottom of the hill coming up.
Yeah, hold on a moment. We'll get him back here.
Yeah, he's back.
Yeah, your screen share is now loading again. We're going to have to take a closer look at this after today to figure out exactly what's going on, because this is the second one of these that we've had in a row with this issue. We didn't lose Dan last week, but we seem to be losing you more. I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah. Can you see me now?
Yep.
Okay.
Please continue.
So long and short, and I'll try to be quick on this one since we're losing a little time, but if you see the blue truck kind of at the bottom of the picture on the left, and the little knock of the concrete, that's the guy that was driving to work at 5 a.m. In the morning, kind of in the dark of the night, and he drives into a hole, and he leaves behind a young daughter and a widow now because the bridge has collapsed. And what basically happened here, the lady that was coming this way and fell in the hole, she lived. She wasn't quite going as fast because she was just coming from the light. But basically what happened, 2 generations of bridges, and the bridge that was built on the right, I love this discussion for reliability and systems engineering. It's a good static example. But the people, the DOT and the bridge designer didn't want to connect the new structure that you see with the concrete piles in the picture on the right to the bridge on the left, which had timber piles that was built earlier. And I wondered for a long time, I said, if that had done a risk evaluation, let's ignore reliability for a minute, let's just say a risk evaluation, they may have found that this risk wasn't worth taking. And then through the investigation, I found out they did do a risk analysis at some point. But it really depends on where you sit, because to the DOT administrator and the DOT, Department of Transportation, basically what risk was it? Theirs was a risk of allocation of the money they had. So why would I put protective bollards or redo the main bridge? So risk to them was in the whole portfolio, this was maybe a rare event. To the consulting firm, they didn't want to attach their new structure to the old structure, because if there were settlements or problem with the old structure, then their insurance company would blame them. But what I've always heard on the quality side is the voice of the customer. And the voice of the customer I always have heard is the guy on the left there that went in the hole and died, and wonder what his voice was the minute before impact. Because that's really where it matters. That's really where the risk base has to take place, because regardless of how rare this is, these bridges were going to should he have expected to go into the hole?
You're not sharing your slides. We lost your slides again.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that.
Now you probably got them. Sorry. And so at the end of the day, as you look through the pictures of the aftermath, and it was interesting because in this case, we talk about risk management. We thought for certain that we were working for the Department of Transportation here. We thought this was a slam dunk case where the railroad would have to pay. The railroad ended up saying that the bridge fell over and fell on their perfectly good train, which somehow dropped on it halfway through the train. So we spent a long time convincing, in legal matters, convincing how the physics of failure would work here, that the bridge just didn't fall out of the blue on the train. But the interesting part on the root cause analysis on the right was, at the end of the day, this event that was caused by rain was in part mainly by stormwater, and there was a big argument between the DOT and the railroad of who had the responsibility. It ends up that the railroad had the responsibility, luckily for the DOT. But the point for the risk conversation is these approaches really much depend on who's making that decision, how they're defining it, and what their motivations are. The other thing I want to talk about for just a second is risk and uncertainty. And I go back, I like the classic definitions. Frank Knight was a economist, but he wrote a lot about risk, and he wrote about it back at the beginning of the 1900s. But it still served the test of time. And basically what he said was that risk is the measurable part of what we do. That uncertainty is that unknown or that unquantifiable thing that we do from a practical standpoint. Jimmy Savage, who I'll talk about in the next slide, was another great person. He was the statistician of the Manhattan Project, and really the first Bayesian type statistical person. He's the father of the Bayesian analysis, modern Bayesian movement. And he said kind of the same thing, that we have certain types of risk, but the risk to him was what was quantifiable, and the true uncertainty was the less quantifiable. And then we go beyond that. Gary Klein, who has done a lot with experience and expertise, and firefighters and healthcare physicians and all this kind of stuff, to basically talk about the definition of uncertainty as those missing pieces of data that we'll never get. And Carl Spetzler, of course, provides that definition, who I mentioned earlier. One of the things that when we talk about risks, I've mentioned the idea of risk and uncertainty, but this was from the Wingspread Conference. And if you're in the world of environmental or human health, you hear a lot about the precautionary principle. We don't hear about that much in the built environment, but we hear about it in the precautionary principle in the natural or ecosystem or health-based environment. And you guys can read this, but basically what it says is risk management is FELDS. Because when we look at all the tens of thousands of chemicals that are being produced every day, and how not just the dosage of chemicals, but how those chemicals react with each other and how they react with our bodies, we really don't know. And so from an environmental standpoint, what the precautionary principle would say is that basically, if you want to bring a new chemical to line or some kind of new discharge or air or water, that it's incumbent on the person making that application to prove first that it will not have an adverse effect. Well, of course, in a big world with uncertainty, with emerging chemicals that can't be tested, that's pretty hard to do. But nevertheless, you see things that in environmental policy and even in drug-related policy, like in the pharmaceuticals I do. You see a lot with validation, and you see a lot with long lead times to get drugs to market because of this precautionary principle that we don't want to have unintended consequences. And so the uncertainty before us, especially with new and emerging products, should be greater than this risk world we live in, which can be smaller, where we can measure things and we have histories of things. And that's exactly what Jimmy Savage said when he talked about small worlds and large worlds. If you guys really love decision making and you love numbers, and I know a lot of people on the call do because they're quality people and reliability people and engineering and financial types, all kinds on the call. Look at Jimmy Savage's 1954 book, Foundations of Statistics. There's a 1970 or 72 update, but I will tell you it's not very much about statistics. It's a lot about decision making. And what Jimmy Savage
Stand by a moment. We'll hopefully get him back.
in a world full of...
We lost your slides, JD.
Mm-hmm. So in a world full of certainty, right, in small worlds where we can decompose problems, and that's what we're taught in systems engineering, that's what we're taught in problem solving, that's what we're taught in decision making, is break things into smaller chunks. And in those smaller chunks, that's what Jimmy Savage, the father of the Manhattan Project, kind of said was, in those small worlds, we can add things up and we can do quantitative analysis and we can do all kind of great decision making because we've got access to the numbers if we'll just use approaches to that. But in big worlds, where there's a lot of uncertainty, where there's a lot of complexity, where there's things that we don't know a lot about, all of these techniques kind of fall apart, right? And sometimes you've got to realize in the work you're in, whether I'm working in a small world or a large world. Gary Klein talked about this too in his work. But in the small worlds, again, what I'll leave you is risk can dominate and all those great risk analysis and real tools will work. But in big worlds where the precautionary principle may apply, big worlds where hurricanes are coming in and there's a lot of uncertainty, Monte Carlo gets us to a point, but in another way, one of the big things that matters most in an uncertain world is expertise. And expertise is not necessarily experience, because we could do something wrong for 30 years and still not have learned from it. But expertise is really when you combine feedback with experience. And so that's when you have these large world problems. Large world, you need to do your calculations. You need to know your number. But at some point, somebody's just got to have a little bit of experience and a little bit of expertise to go there. So what I say is 3 things matter a lot in risk-based decision-making, especially in an uncertainty-based decision-making. You need subject matter expertise. And I'm back, I hope.
Yep, you're back again.
Okay, so coming to a close here, a couple slides. I go to my transition slide, and I added you this because I thought it was a nice time to add it. As Hurricane Florence is coming at the East Coast, and I'm getting ready in a wide range of industry of how do we prepare and recover. But as of last Thursday, September the 6th, this was all the tropical storms, cyclones that had ever been developed, and all the models. This is where they all said, this is where all the tracks used to be. And so you would say last week, from a risk-based approach, no matter what model you put it into based on the historical tracks, there wouldn't be any problem on the East Coast right now. But there was some uncertainty because this one's coming a little bit higher and it's coming straighter. And so today we know that a Category 3 or Category 4 is almost certain. So time matters, unknown information matters, the combination of the two, and how do we frame uncertainty up really matters when we're talking about what's about to hit us today. So I'll leave you with a few key takeaways. I'll leave you 8. I won't reread all these to you, but you'll have them in the slideshows. And then finally, I'll end here and say, hopefully I've given you a little bit of insight, both in risk and risk-based, combining risk with decision-making, and really thinking about systems, risk, uncertainty, and the tools we should use. My favorite tool in all of this is Monte Carlo analysis. It has its limitations too, but as a tool to help you work through risk and uncertainty, especially uncertainty, there's nothing better than doing simulations. And so I'll leave it with that. And Norval, we can do some question and answer if anybody has anything.
Okay, thank you, JD. A bit of an echo there.
Yeah, I don't have it here.
Okay. Well, one of the questions that you had earlier is, what is the difference between slide number 20 versus FMEA?
That's almost that's out of the previous presenters. And if you look at risk-based decision making, as far as the documentation, that's where this comes from, probably from the previous presenter. But it is a lot, almost identically, out of failure modes and effects analysis. That is correct.
Okay, folks, looks like we have a little under 5 minutes left before the top of the hour. If you do have some questions here, and oh, there is one.
I got a question there about do these tools overlap, right?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. The same tools we use in risk analysis, we use in quality management, we used in financial management, we use in reliability, and we use in decision making. And so I think mastering the tools, that's just one reason why the tools aren't the most important things. You've got to have an approach. And what I say about approaches are there's theories which belong to philosophers, or philosophies that belong to philosophers, theories that belong to academics, and approaches that belong to practitioners. So when I'm teaching a kid to hit, or I'm running a sailboat race, I have to have an approach. And that approach uses a lot of tools and has a lot of options in it, but it is an approach with tools. And so one of the keys at a foundational level is to understand the tools and then to work your way up into how to apply those tools with approaches from a very similar standpoint. But all these do overlap, and someone even said medicine, and yes, I work in healthcare too, and it applies in pharmaceuticals and the human health side of things as well. So all of these tools are common to all those practices. So probably like Jimmy Savage said, we decompose things into small worlds and we attack them, which is good, but sometimes we don't know what the other world's looking at when we only deal in small worlds. What did this application of a discipline? Do you see that, Norval? I missed that.
Yeah, I do see that. That one just appeared up on in the chat box. Hello?
Well, did you see that one? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we lost you there for about 10 seconds, about the application of a discipline to parts, product, systems, environment, etc.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
I don't know.
But if they'll email me, you guys have my email address here. Whoever sent that in, email me, and I'll try to answer that the best I can. And again, in addition to any comments you give Norval, any feedback to me is always greatly appreciated. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, and you'll get an email from Chris, JD.
Okay.
Any other questions from anybody? I don't know what was going on here today as far as dropping JD like every 5 minutes, but we managed to still muddle our way through it today. We're glad that everybody had the patience to get through it. We're going to have to go back and look at some things here to see if we can figure out what went on today. As somebody said, you don't typically see this with a lot of webinar services. Okay, and you'll be getting, Joe says he'll be emailing you too, JD, as well as to use the tools and how to decide which tool to use and when.
Very good. Okay. Love the chat.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Any other questions from anybody before we go? Okay. Well, JD, thank you very much for presenting for us today. Sorry about the transmission issues. Like I said, don't know exactly what those were all about today.
Well, we're done. So it wore me out, but hopefully people can look past that and hopefully give you reviews or comments on the content, and certainly sounds like you've had some problems twice now with the system. So I know you're going to get that fixed. So no worries there. Great.
Yeah, we're going to take a look at it for sure. Anyway, like I said, thanks, JD. And next Wednesday, a week from Wednesday, September the 19th, it's Sustainability, a Leadership Perspective on Engaging Employees to Drive Sustainable Business with Susan D'Souza of Staples Advantage Canada. Hopefully many of you will join us for that one on Wednesday of next week. We hopefully will get this other issue taken care of between now and then. Anyway, thanks again for everyone joining us, and we look forward to seeing you possibly next week. Until then, I hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Thanks. Bye.